What if the most dangerous man in Chicago was never actually on the streets? The guards did their rounds at 3 a.m., flashlights cutting through the dark hallways of Stateville Correctional Center. They checked the cells, counted the bodies, made their marks on the clipboard. Everything looked normal. Every prisoner was exactly where they were supposed to be. Larry Hoover was in his bunk, eyes closed, breathing slow. But somewhere outside those walls, a drug deal worth $500,000 was going down in his name. Nobody moved a gram of cocaine on the south side of Chicago without his permission. Nobody opened a new corner, recruited a new member, or made a major decision without his blessing. And yet, Larry Hoover hadn't breathed free air since 1973. He hadn't seen a sunrise that wasn't framed by barbed wire and concrete. He was sitting in one of the most secure prisons in Illinois, and somehow, impossibly, terrifyingly, he was running everything. This is the story of how that happened, and it starts not in a prison, but on a cracked sidewalk in Englewood.
Chicago in the late 1960s was a city eating itself alive. The civil rights movement had shaken the country. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, and the ghettos of the South Side were boiling over with rage, poverty, and hopelessness. Young black men with no jobs, no futures, and no protection from the constant threat of violence on their blocks did what young men in impossible situations have always done. They banded together. Larry Hoover was 16 years old when he started building something on those streets. He wasn't the biggest kid. He wasn't the most physically intimidating, but he had something rarer and more dangerous than muscle. He had a mind that could organize people, inspire loyalty, and see several moves ahead of everyone else around him. In 1968, he co-founded the Supreme Gangsters on the south side of Chicago alongside David Barksdale. These were two young men from the bottom of American society, with nothing but the block they stood on and the people willing to stand with them. Within a few years, the Supreme Gangsters merged with the Black Disciples, and the Gangster Disciples were born. It was one of the most significant gang mergers in American urban history, and almost nobody outside of Chicago was paying attention. They should have been. Hoover had a vision that went beyond simply controlling territory. He thought about structure, hierarchy, ranks, and rules. The Gangster Disciples weren't just a gang. Under Hoover's guidance, they became an organization with a command structure that looked almost military. There were ranks, there were codes, there were oaths. Members swore loyalty not just to the street, but to the organization itself. It was brilliant, and it was terrifying, because it meant the whole thing could survive even when individual members fell. The machine had been designed to keep running. By the early 1970s, Hoover was becoming a legend. And then, at just 21 years old, everything changed.
In 1973, Larry Hoover was convicted of murdering a 19-year-old named William Young during a robbery. The details of the case were disputed. The neighborhood was divided, and Hoover's supporters maintained his innocence with a passion that only grew stronger over the years. But the courts didn't see it that way. The judge sentenced him to 150 to 200 years in prison. 150 years. Most people, handed that sentence at 21, would have broken. They would have retreated into themselves, accepted the reality of those walls, and slowly disappeared from the world. That's what the system was designed to make happen. That's what everyone expected. Larry Hoover had other plans. From the moment he entered the Illinois prison system, Hoover began doing something that nobody had really done before at that scale. He turned the prison itself into a headquarters. He understood something that law enforcement didn't fully grasp for years. Walls keep people in, but they don't stop information from flowing. Messages could move. Visitors could carry instructions. Lawyers could become unwitting couriers. Phone calls, even monitored ones, could be coded. A man sitting in a cell with nothing but time on his hands could think more clearly, plan more carefully, and communicate more deliberately than any street-level operator running on adrenaline and paranoia. Hoover became more organized behind bars than he had ever been on the streets.
He built a communication network that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Coded letters went in and out of the prison disguised as personal correspondence. Visitors, family members, friends, associates would sit across from him in the visiting room and carry messages out in their memories, sometimes in writing, hidden in clothing. His words traveled from Stateville to the streets of Chicago like electrical current moving through wire, invisible but absolutely real. By the time his orders reached the corners, they had passed through so many hands that tracing them back to a prison cell was nearly impossible. And the Gangster Disciples grew. While their leaders sat in a cell, the organization expanded beyond anything it had been when he was free. By the 1980s, as crack cocaine exploded across American cities and turned struggling neighborhoods into war zones, the Gangster Disciples were perfectly positioned to capitalize. They had the structure, they had the discipline, they had the network, and they had a leader who had been sitting in a quiet cell for a decade, thinking about nothing but how to build a better organization. The money started flowing in amounts that were almost incomprehensible for a street gang. Some estimates would later place the Gangster Disciples' drug revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars across their peak years. The south side of Chicago became their empire, and that empire was being administered from behind prison walls.
What made Hoover's story particularly complicated, and what gave him a layer of protection for years, was that he was genuinely two things at once, and the world couldn't figure out which one was real. In the 1990s, Hoover began publicly positioning himself as a reformed man with a social mission. He renamed the Gangster Disciples the Growth and Development Organization. He gave speeches, through representatives, through letters, through supporters, about community uplift, political engagement, and helping young black men find a path out of poverty. He encouraged members to vote. He talked about education. Politicians in Chicago began treating him as a community leader of sorts, someone with influence over a population that the city needed to reach. It was masterful, because some of it was genuine. Hoover was an intelligent man who had grown up in brutal circumstances, and his thinking about community and black empowerment wasn't entirely cynical performance. He had read, studied, and thought deeply about the condition of poor black communities in American cities. There were people, teachers, preachers, former members, who believed sincerely that he was trying to change, that growth and development was a real attempt to transform something destructive into something meaningful. But the cocaine was still moving. The corners were still being controlled. The violence was still being authorized, and the money was still flowing up the chain to a man in a prison cell.
The FBI watched all of this with growing fury and growing fascination. They had informants, they had phone taps, they had surveillance on visitors to the prison. But building a case against someone who communicated through layers of intermediaries, who had spent 20 years perfecting a system of deniability, who had lawyers and community supporters and political connections, that was a different kind of challenge than kicking down a door and finding drugs on a table. It took years. It took hundreds of hours of recorded phone calls. It took informants working their way into the inner circles. It took the full weight of a federal RICO investigation, the same legal framework that had been used to dismantle the Italian mafia, being brought down on a street gang that had outgrown every definition of what a street gang was supposed to be. In 1995, the feds moved. Operation Headache, and the name itself was telling because that's exactly what Larry Hoover had been for law enforcement for 2 decades, resulted in a massive sweep of arrests. Dozens of high-ranking members were indicted. The evidence was overwhelming. Intercepted conversations, financial records, testimony from witnesses who had seen the organization from the inside. Hoover was convicted in federal court in 1997 on charges including drug conspiracy and extortion. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. He was moved to ADX Florence in Colorado, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the most secure prison in the United States, the place where they put people when they don't just want to incarcerate them, but want to make them disappear from the world entirely. It seemed like the end. The FBI celebrated. The papers ran stories about the fall of the most powerful gang leader in Chicago history.
Politicians gave speeches. Law enforcement officials shook hands in front of cameras. And for a while, it really did seem like it was over.
But here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody talks about. After Hoover was moved to ADX Florence, after the federal case had supposedly dismantled the Gangster Disciples' leadership, after all the speeches and celebrations, the gang didn't collapse. It didn't dissolve. It didn't fade away like an organization that had lost its center. It fractured, and in some ways, fracturing made it more dangerous. Without Hoover's centralized control, without the single voice that could give orders and expect obedience across the entire organization, local factions began operating independently. Different sets, different neighborhoods, different leaders, all claiming the Gangster Disciples' name, all fighting each other for territory, all making their own decisions without any of the discipline or structure that Hoover had imposed. The violence that followed the dismantling of his centralized control was, by some measurements, worse than what had existed before, which raised a question that nobody in law enforcement wanted to say out loud. Had Hoover's iron control over the organization actually been, in some terrible and ironic way, a stabilizing force? Had the presence of one authoritative voice, one man who could say, "This is not allowed," and be obeyed, kept the chaos at a level that, while devastating, was at least somewhat contained? The FBI had spent years and enormous resources to bring down the king. And when the king fell, the kingdom didn't become peaceful. It became ungovernable. Hoover himself, sitting in the most isolated prison in America, with almost no contact with the outside world, reportedly followed this disintegration with deep frustration. The organization he had spent his life building, the structure he had maintained even from behind bars, it was being torn apart by the very people who claimed to represent it. His name was being used to justify violence he had never sanctioned, by people who had never had the discipline he had demanded. There's a bitter poetry in that. A man who built an empire loses control of it not when he's arrested, but when the government finally succeeds in cutting off his ability to lead it. The removal of his voice didn't bring peace to Chicago's South Side. It brought a different kind of war.
Larry Hoover is still alive. He is in his early 70s now, sitting in ADX Florence, one of the most isolated human beings on Earth. His case has attracted unlikely advocates over the years. Most famously, rapper Kanye West visited the Trump White House in 2018 partly to argue for Hoover's release, calling him a victim of an unjust system. Hoover's family and supporters have maintained for decades that the federal case against him was built on questionable informants and political pressure, that the man being kept in solitary confinement bears little resemblance to the street-level violence the government used to justify his imprisonment. The government, for its part, says he is exactly where he belongs. The truth, as with everything about Larry Hoover's life, is probably somewhere in the space between the official story and the mythology, in that complicated territory where a human being contains both the capacity for genuine vision and the capacity for terrible destruction, where the same intelligence that could have built something remarkable instead built something that cost an unknowable number of people their lives, their freedom, and their futures. What's undeniable is this. For nearly 3 decades, a man sitting in a prison cell ran one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. He proved that walls are only as effective as the silence they can enforce. He proved that an organization built on deep enough loyalty and smart enough structure can operate without its leader's physical presence. He proved, in the most disturbing way possible, that the right mind in the wrong circumstances can do things that seem absolutely impossible. The guards still do their rounds in the middle of the night. They still check the cells, count the bodies, make their marks on the clipboard. But somewhere in the deepest, most isolated wing of the most secure prison in the United States, an old man lies awake, and you have to wonder what he thinks about when he thinks about Chicago, and whether, even now, anyone is still listening.
The throne was real. The king is caged, but no one has ever fully controlled what he built, and that might be the most frightening part of the whole story.